Well, hello everyone, my name is Austin Nottingham, and I will be discussing water resource management as it pertains to global warming or global climate change and the Great Lakes Basin. And this is of local significance to me. Since this is an international community of scholars, I thought I should start off by providing a geographical context. I'm in the United States. Zooming in a bit further, I'm in New York State. And important things that I'd like you to notice in this map are, along the border with Canada, we have Lake Ontario and Lake Erie, which are extremely important later. Zooming in one more time, that little red dot is my hometown. It's a tiny town and doesn't have much of interest going on hydrologically, but it draws all of its water from Lake Erie, which you clearly see, and that's connected in really interesting ways to the hydrological system, so that's where I chose to focus my presentation. Let's start with the Lake Erie basics. It's 380 kilometers long, 92 kilometers wide, 19 meters deep on average, and it contains 484 cubic kilometers of water while covering 25,700 square kilometers. Sorry if the notation's a bit ambiguous there. The other numbers, mainly the 4s, are there for reference purposes. I'll show you the references a bit later. Another interesting note, there are 1,402 kilometers of shoreline. Okay, continuing with the lake basics and discussing a few less numerical things. It's the shallowest of the Great Lakes, and it's the most variable in terms of water level. That becomes extremely important later because water level is one of the key things that is affected by global climate change. Also, it obtains its water from Lake Superior, through Lake Michigan, through Lake Huron. So the entire Great Lakes system is connected, and you can't understand Lake Erie in isolation. That would have made my job so much simpler, but it's just not something that can be done. In order to really understand Lake Erie, you have to understand what's going on with the lakes that feed it water and the entire Great Lakes Basin. Which brings us to the hydrologically relevant area. This is a picture of the Great Lakes Basin. You see Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and then how that connects to Lake Erie and Lake Ontario all the way at the end. While geographically speaking, all the water comes from Lake Erie for our small town, hydrologically speaking, this basin is really the relevant unit. So let's explore the fundamentals of this basin. It's the largest freshwater resource in North America and one of the largest in the world. The surface area of the lakes and the land together equals 766,000 square kilometers. It contains 20% of the world's fresh water and has a staggering storage capacity of 23,000 cubic kilometers of water. The shoreline is 17,000 kilometers, and that means that it is comparable to some of our coastlines with the oceans, if you look at the U.S. as a whole. There's more coastline, considering the Great Lakes, than there is between the U.S. and the oceans. In terms of water use, 4 trillion liters of water are extracted from the Lakes Basin daily to feed industry as well as personal use. 20% of the U.S. population and 60% of Canada's population live within the Great Lakes drainage basin. 50 million people depend on this basin for their water supply. Agriculture, industry, and tourism are all dependent on these lakes and are some of the competing interests when you start talking about water management. So this system is extremely important and I have a local connection because my water comes from Lake Erie. So, what's driving the system? Runoff, over lake precipitation, and over lake evaporation really influence the water levels. Interestingly enough, these lakes have a really long residence time. Not so much Lake Erie, but Lake Superior and the other lakes have extremely long residence times, some exceeding 100 years, which means that the basin as a whole isn't as renewable as we'd like to think it is, which has implications later on. Also, each Great Lake will be affected slightly differently by climate change, and water quality and water levels are the two most important factors when assessing climate change's effect on the lakes. So I know this is review and pretty basic, but I thought I should at least cover in outline the climate change factors that impact the lakes. Greenhouse gases are accumulating in the atmosphere, which leads to an increase in average global temperature. Between now and 2100, this will increase 1.1 to 6.4 degrees Celsius, depending on which projection you're talking about. Evaporation, precipitation, and essentially all the other aspects of the hydrologic cycle will be profoundly affected by this change. And we know with a reasonable degree of certainty that a majority of this change is anthropogenic. At least 50%, maybe more. So how do changes in climate interact with the Great Lakes Basin water supply? Pretty much all the sources agree that there's potential for water levels to shift substantially. There's considerable uncertainty as to what exactly will shift in which lakes and how much. Okay, traditionally, it was expected that there would be some substantial decreases in water supply, whereas newer sources sometimes predict substantial increases in water supply, which makes a water management strategy really complex. So let's explore this variability in more detail. The most extreme projections show that some of the Great Lakes could vary by a huge amount. They could either decrease by 3 meters in height or increase by 1.5 meters. And there's also some studies showing that the entire system is experiencing an increase in water flowing through it, which would indicate that water levels should be increasing, which really contradicts the conventional wisdom and the long-held assumption that global warming would drop these water levels substantially. Also, we as humans monitor and affect how the water system works, and how we manage upstream lakes will impact water levels in downstream lakes like Erie and Ontario. So how are we going to address this uncertainty problem? Increasing water levels would require us to beef up flood defenses and to prepare for major damage, perhaps associated with more extreme weather and higher water levels, whereas decreasing water levels require us to build infrastructure to maintain access to necessary water. So Moody and Brown wrote a really in-depth paper in 2012 which provides a really interesting solution to this particular problem. They use a climate response function, which is essentially a formula which, instead of taking the traditional approach and basing the outcome on a prediction from a particular climate model, has parameters that you can just plug in the results of any climate model and see what it's going to do. And this formula relates lake levels to any climate model you want to use. And then they determined the effects of various lake levels on stakeholders, mainly your agriculture, your industry, your tourism, your people living on the coasts. And they divided this into 3 major zones. Zone A are fluctuations in lake level that don't have a significant negative impact. Zone B are fluctuations in lake level that negatively impact the stakeholders, but In that case, the negative impacts are temporary and reversible. Zone C is when we start getting into some really frightening impacts where they're major impacts that could not be reversible, and they would be negative impacts for the stakeholders. Here they graph out the different ranges for the zones B and C impacts for the various Great Lakes. Over here we look at Lake Erie, and looking at Lake Erie on the end, we see that coasts are the most vulnerable part of the system, in the sense that the distance between the zones B and C impacts and the distance between the impacts in general is smallest. And that's a general trend that holds for most of the lakes. So now we have these zones of impact related to changing water levels. How do we determine the probability that we'll experience a water level in one of these zones? They took a large historical data set, and then they used stochastic variation to expand the data set in hopes of including all the plausible variation in lake level that could occur based on any of these climate models, which I think is a little bit overwhelming of a task, and I'm not so sure they succeeded. But what they did discover is that the mean water level, which makes sense, the average water level, the standard deviation of that water level, which is how variable it is in any given time frame, and the serial correlation, which means essentially how much is the current water level based on the past, and how much will the current water level influence the future. And those three factors together essentially determined how likely it was that you would end up in one of these three zones. So, what's the takeaway message? Essentially, any climatic conditions which increase or decrease the mean NBS, which is the net basin supply, or that increase the standard deviation of that supply, are going to have a negative impact. And water regulations that optimize impacts for one lake often have negative impacts on other lakes. Also, they really need to publish data for Erie and Ontario, because that graph that I showed you from the paper was the only graph that really showed detailed data for Erie and Ontario, and they focused on the upper Great Lakes, which will have a trickle-down effect into Erie and Ontario, and how we manage the water upstream affects how we manage the water downstream. But it would be really useful to see Erie and Ontario's data separately. They didn't state this directly, but from what I read, I infer that Lake Erie might be particularly vulnerable. It's the second to last lake in the system, which means whatever they do upstream will impact it. And it's a shallow lake that already experiences high variability in water level. So what's necessary here is a really coordinated effort across the entire basin to take this approach and average out the effects so that you optimize the effects for all 5 lakes over the widest possible range of climatic variables, because there's uncertainty. So, other than lake levels, what are the other important issues? There's essentially 2. Runoff management, and as a subcategory of runoff management, we have its impact on water quality, and the question of water diversions. So, what should be done about runoff? Lots of studies predict essentially, because overall wet climates will get wetter and dry climates will get drier with most climate models, that runoff will increase in our area. This may not increase lake levels because there's some complicated interactions with evaporation and other climatic factors, but runoff is going to increase. So what does this mean in terms of local water management? We need to increase the capacity of our stormwater management systems. And we also need to increase permeable surfaces in urban planning, because permeable surfaces will let water infiltrate and decrease runoff. We also may want to consider creating buffer zones and eliminating any combined sewers if they still exist in the region, because as runoff increases and stormwater discharge increases, there's greater probability for those types of sewers to release pollution into the environment and degrade the water quality of the entire basin. So, what about diversions? Global climate change, as I said before, will probably dry out significant portions of the west and southwestern United States. And there's been ideas around for a very long time about exporting water from the Great Lakes, because we have so much of it, to these more arid regions. And these are somewhat appealing. There's a certain sense of nationalism that we help out our fellow citizens of the country by exporting water to them and alleviating their water stress. But there's a lot of climate change uncertainty, and as I discussed earlier, the lake systems aren't really as renewable as we think they are because of those long retention times. So it may not be wise to export a bunch of water until we have more certainty about how the system is going to operate when exposed to climate change. To this end, there's several laws ranging from local informal agreements all the way up to national and international treaties that essentially state that all of the governors and important government officials in the provinces have to agree in order to allow bulk water export. And the result of this is that, in general, this is not approved. And continuing in this path of reticence in terms of not approving things like exporting large quantities of Great Lakes water to recharge the Ogallala Aquifer is a good plan. So, bringing it back to the overall picture, what are the basic planning steps we should be doing on a local and sometimes less than local level to prepare for the effects global warming and global climate change will have on Lake Erie and the basin as a whole and our water supply? We should definitely prepare to manage increased runoff, because that's fairly certain. We should also increase our water conservation, because while it's not certain that lake levels will drop substantially, if they do, every little bit of conservation will help, and if they increase and we conserve, that actually could open up more water to send to drier areas if we decide in the long run that that's a good idea. And we also need to really perform a thoroughgoing analysis in the style of Moody and Brown so that we know what the risks are and whether the lakes are going to go up and down, and so that we can either prepare for the flood risks from them going up, or prepare the infrastructure so that the water is still available if they go down. Thank you for taking the time to watch this. I really hope you've appreciated it and that I've made it interesting, and please review it kindly. That's all. Thank you very much again. Bye.